Imagine you are, the most influential person in your entire nation. You've spent decades building this massive legacy.
Yeah, you've got armies at your disposal.
Right. Armies, wealth, status, what seems like absolute security. But tonight, you aren't sleeping in a palace. Tonight, you are sleeping in the dirt.
Out in the wilderness.
Out in the wilderness. You are running for your life. And the most agonizing part, I think, is that you are not running from an invading empire or like a foreign rival. You are running from your own child.
Your own son.
Your own son is actively hunting you, and he has convinced almost your entire nation to help him do it.
It's a staggering scenario, really.
It really is. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, our mission for this deep dive is a comprehensive verse-by-verse theological analysis of Psalm 3. And to give you the proper context, we had to paint that very visceral picture of the historical setting I just described.
Because we are looking at King David.
Right, King David. The sheer bitter sorrow of this domestic betrayal is the backdrop for everything we're going to talk about today. It sets up our central theme, which is how a person handles absolute despair, mockery, and the very real threat of death by relying on divine promises.
It's a heavy topic.
Very heavy. Joining me today to make sense of this is our resident analytical voice, who is going to help unpack the theology and the history behind this text. We're going to look closely at the mechanics of this affliction, the psychological warfare of the enemies, and the actual miracle of finding rest in the middle of a literal manhunt.
Because, you have the anointed king of Israel reduced to hiding in caves and ravines. He's facing an unanticipated rebellion from his own flesh and blood, Absalom. The betrayal is just so intimate, it's not just political.
No, it's personal.
Highly personal.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the root cause of David's affliction. David has been dethroned. He's forsaken by almost everyone.
He's basically got nothing left.
Right. He has only a handful of faithful friends, relying on whatever hiding places he can find in the Judean wilderness just to escape this sudden, massive disaster. But this isn't just a story of bad luck or the poor political strategy, is it?
Not at all. We really can't look at this disaster as a simple political failing on David's part. The theological root of this affliction is what makes the situation so agonizing. David recognizes that this rebellion is a direct chastisement from God. It's for his own prior sins.
The history there is pretty dark.
Yeah. Specifically, the historical record points to his guilt in defiling another man's wife, Bathsheba, and shedding the innocent blood of her husband, Uriah.
Let's linger on that for a second because the psychological weight of that realization is it's staggering. He is looking at his son leading an army against him, and he knows, I brought this upon myself.
Wow.
This is the consequence of my own treachery. If I am in that situation, I'm crushed. The knowledge that my own moral failure created the environment for this rebellion, that would make me sink into absolute despair.
Oh, totally.
I'd be entirely overwhelmed with anguish.
And that's the natural human reaction, right? When God makes use of wicked and mischievous men as scourges to chastise us, it forces a reckoning. You are face to face with your own guilt.
Yeah.
But there is a crucial detail here. David makes no allusion to his own sins in this specific psalm.
Wait, really? None at all?
None. We can infer from this silence that Psalm 3 only comprises one part of his prayers. Since God punished him expressly for his adultery and his treachery toward Uriah, there's no doubt David was initially distressed with, grievous and dreadful torments of mind.
Sure. He had to process the fact that the sword was never going to depart from his house.
Right, but Psalm 3 catches him after that initial agonizing torment. He has moved past the initial shock of the discipline.
I have to push back here, though. Or at least I want to voice the question that immediately comes to mind for anyone listening.
Okay, go for it.
If David knows he brought this upon himself, and if he knows he's being actively disciplined by God, why doesn't he just throw his hands up and surrender?
That's a very fair question.
How does a person find comfort in the very authority that is currently actively punishing them? If God raised up this scourge, if God allowed Absalom to rebel as a form of discipline, isn't crying out to God to stop it completely contradictory?
That question gets right to the core of the Reformed perspective on discipline. Acknowledging that we suffer nothing which we do not deserve is a mechanism that leads to repentance, not despair.
Okay, so separating the two.
Yes, we have to separate those two concepts. Despair says, I am condemned, God has abandoned me, and this punishment is my final destruction.
Right, it's hopeless.
But repentance says, I am guilty, and I deserve this discipline, but the judge is also my redeemer. God's use of wicked men as scourges does not negate God's overarching grace toward his children.
So you are saying David views this as fatherly discipline rather than final condemnation.
Precisely. After David humbled himself before God regarding the whole Uriah situation, he took courage. Being well assured of having obtained forgiveness for his soul, he was fully persuaded that God was still on his side. The discipline is real, the consequences are real, but his standing as an adopted child of God remains intact.
That is such a fascinating mental shift. He knows the chastisement is painful, but he also knows the forgiveness is complete.
Yeah.
He knew God would always preside over his kingdom and show himself its protector, even while administering discipline. So he can still complain to God about his son and the whole faction involved in the conspiracy.
Because he knows Absalom and the rebels wickedly rose up for the purpose of frustrating the decree of God.
Right. They aren't acting as righteous agents of justice.
No, they are acting as treasonous rebels, and that is a vital distinction. The enemies are fighting against God rather than just against David. Even though God is allowing it for David's discipline, Absalom's intent is to overthrow God's anointed king. So the instruction for us is clear. If our enemies, in persecuting us, fight against God, let the consideration of their doing so be immediately followed by the confident persuasion of our safety under his protection.
The rebels are despising and trampling underfoot the grace that God has promised David.
Spot on.
Thinking about you listening to this, it is incredibly easy to relate this to the everyday realities of facing consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
When we make a mistake, when we cause our own disasters, maybe a financial ruin, a broken relationship, a career setback, it's so easy to sink into that anguish. We think our failure disqualifies us from divine help forever.
We think we're done.
Right. We think, I made my bed, now I have to lie in it, and God is just going to watch me suffer. But David's response models a radically different reaction. He accepts the discipline, humbles himself, and then boldly asks for help from the very God who is disciplining him.
Because he understands the difference between punitive wrath, intended to destroy, and fatherly correction, intended to refine. And that brings us directly into the text of the psalm itself, looking at verses 1 and 2.
Let's hear it.
David writes, O Lord, how are my oppressors multiplied? Many rise up against me. Many say to my soul, there is no help for him in God.
The sheer volume of opposition is staggering. I mean, the sacred history from 2 Samuel tells us he had nearly as many enemies as he had subjects.
The whole nation seemed to turn on a dime.
Literally overnight. He's terrified by the massive numbers opposed to him. Nothing could have taken place more unlooked for than so sudden a rebellion. One day he is holding court. The next day he's fleeing out the back gate of Jerusalem.
What's fascinating here is the specific nature of the taunt they hurl at him. There is no help for him in God.
Yeah, that hurts.
It does. They aren't just commenting on his tactical disadvantage. They aren't just saying David is out of troops or David is out of money. They're making a theological declaration.
Right.
When we analyze the mindset of this ungodly faction, we see that Absalom and his followers are not relying on divine favor at all. They place all their hope in their own strength, their own political maneuvering, and their own fortune.
They view David as a castaway, like completely rejected by heaven. The assumption is that because David is suffering, God must hate him.
That's how they see it.
Their boldness actually increased because they were confident he had been rejected by God. It's a very human way of looking at circumstances, though. If you are losing, God must be against you.
And there is an indirect reference to their ungodliness here. They made no account of the help of God in preserving the king whom he had chosen. Absalom entirely disregards God, hoping for victory purely from his own resources and his stolen popularity.
Right.
David explicitly introduces both Absalom and the rest of the faction, speaking this way to demonstrate a monstrous and outrageous contempt of God.
The presumption is just monstrous. The enemies assume that success is strictly proportionate to physical numbers. They act as if God's favor is totally irrelevant to the outcome of earthly battles.
Yeah, they figure we have the numbers, we have the momentum, we have the capital city, therefore we win.
It's essentially atheism in practice, even if they wouldn't use that word themselves. They might still participate in religious rituals, but functionally, they believe the physical world is all that matters.
Well, the ungodly might not always openly break forth into daring presumption, stating out loud that it's impossible for us to derive any advantage from God's favor. But they ascribe everything to fortune. They hold the firm opinion that a man's success will be in proportion to his physical strength, his wealth, or his social connections. Therefore, they fearlessly rush forward to gain their object by all means, right or wrong, as if it would be equally the same whether God is angry with them or favorable towards them.
They simply don't factor God into their equations at all.
Not even a little bit.
It's so relatable to modern cynicism. You see this all the time today in business and politics, even in our personal lives. The world often mocks believers by reducing all success to mere statistics, to luck, to the algorithm, or just raw, brute effort.
Oh, for sure. Everything is a metric.
Right. They completely discard the invisible variable of divine providence. They look at a situation and say, the math doesn't support your survival. Your startup is going to fail. Your diagnosis is terminal. Your reputation is ruined.
Yeah, just look at the spreadsheets.
They mock the faithful as if it would avail them nothing to be under the care and protection of God. They rely entirely on those spreadsheets.
And that mockery isn't just background noise either. It is a targeted psychological attack. It is designed to break the spirit before the physical battle even begins.
Which brings us to a very specific, highly significant linguistic detail in the Hebrew phrasing David uses to describe his pain.
Right. Let's look at that. There is a fascinating translation debate regarding the Hebrew here. The phrase is often debated between many say to my soul versus many say of my soul.
When we look at the original language, the letter lamed in Hebrew can sometimes be used to mean of or concerning, right?
Yeah, it can. Some translators prefer many say of my soul, meaning they are talking about David behind his back. But a deeper analysis argues that this doesn't give the true intended meaning of the passage. David intended to express something much more intimate and devastating.
He says his heart was in a manner pierced with the mockery of his enemies. That is such a vivid, painful phrase. Pierced with mockery. It's not just gossip. It's a weapon.
The word soul here signifies the seat of the affections, the very core of a person's being. So when they say this to his soul, the mockery is striking David directly in his heart.
It's an internal wound.
Yes. It is the kind of insult that bypasses your intellectual defenses and settles right in your chest. It corresponds to a passage in Psalm 35 where David asks God to say to my soul, I am thy salvation. The soul is the receiver of the message.
That makes a lot of sense.
The ungodly use their endeavors to destroy our souls with despair, so we ought to defend them by our prayers. Instead of listening to the whole world attempting to drive us to hopelessness, we ought to give ear to God alone.
It's an active defense against a psychological assault. And you can imagine the sheer volume of that assault. He's not just hearing one critic, he's hearing many.
Thousands of them.
The echoes of a whole nation saying, God is done with you. And right after this piercing insult, right at the peak of the tension, we hit a word that often confuses people reading the Psalms, Selah. We see it all the time, but what is it actually doing there?
Interpreters are not entirely agree on Selah. Some maintain it's a mark of affirmation, having the same signification as truly or amen. Others understand it as meaning forever.
But the Reformed analytical tradition often sides with a different derivation, right? Something related to the music itself.
Correct. We look at the root word salal, which signifies to lift up. So the strongest conclusion is that it denotes the lifting up of the voice in harmony in the exercise of singing. It is a musical notation.
I find this detail absolutely brilliant. It tells us that the music was adapted to the sentiment of the song. The harmony was in unison with the character or subject matter of the lyrics.
Exactly. That's right.
David has just complained about his enemies, shamefully laughing to scorn his hope, as if God's protection would be of no avail to him. He states the most painful thing a believer could hear, God has abandoned you. And then he uses this word, Selah.
He uses it to deliberately fix the listener's attention on this horrific blasphemy. It is a musical direction that forces the audience to pause, to lift up their voices, or perhaps for the instruments to swell.
Yeah, to really feel it.
To truly feel the weight of the insult that so severely wounded his heart before moving on. It is an intentional structural technique. He doesn't just want you to read the insult and rush to the happy ending. He wants you to sit with the agony of it. He wants you to feel the piercing of the soul.
It makes the text so much more three-dimensional. You can almost hear the choir pausing, the music swelling, highlighting the absolute desolation of a man whose own son is telling him God has abandoned him.
It's a very traumatic moment.
It forces you to stop and ask yourself, what would I do if everyone I knew said God was finished with me? But then we hit verses 3 and 4, and the tone completely shifts. The music changes. But thou, Jehovah, art a shield for me, my glory, and the lifter up of mine head.
The linguistic pivot here is critical. The Hebrew copulative and is best resolved as the disjunctive particle but.
That's a big shift.
This changes everything. David employs language full of confidence, standing in direct opposition to the hardihood and profane scoffings of his enemies. He testifies that whatever they may say, whatever the statistics look like, he will nevertheless rely upon the word of God.
And this reveals a massive shift in his legal and spiritual defense. Remember earlier we talked about his past sins with Uriah and Bathsheba. He knew he deserved chastisement. He knew he was a flawed man.
Yes, very flawed.
But here, he makes no mention of his present calamity as a chastisement. Why? Because having acknowledged his sin before God, having repented and received assurance of forgiveness, he now takes into consideration only the merits of the present cause.
That phrase, the merits of the present cause, is essential to understand. Absalom's war is ungodly. The rebels intend to depose a true and lawful king from his throne, a king placed there by God's decree. David has mourned his own sins, he has humbly betaken himself to the mercy of God, and now he keeps his eyes fixed on the obvious and immediate cause of his afflictions. He can confidently expect God to defend the royal dignity conferred upon him.
Wait, let me press on that because I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If he is currently being punished for Uriah, how can he simultaneously claim that his present cause is righteous?
It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it?
Yeah. How can he say, God, protect my throne, when God is the one shaking the throne?
Because the discipline of God does not validate the sin of the instrument God uses. Absalom is committing treason. Absalom is violating the fifth commandment to honor his father and the commandment against murder, and he is rebelling against God's anointed structure.
Okay, I see.
David is saying, Lord, I am a sinner, and I accept your discipline, but Absalom is attacking your established throne. On the merits of this specific war, I am in the right and he is in the wrong. Therefore, I appeal to your justice.
That is such a vital lesson for anyone dealing with opposition or conflict. You can acknowledge your past failures, but that does not mean every attack against you is righteous.
No, not at all.
It doesn't mean you have to lay down and let people destroy you just because you have a flawed past. Especially when the truth of God is opposed through our being mistreated, we ought to be greatly encouraged. We can glory in the assurance that God will maintain the truth of his own promises against perfidious and abandoned characters.
If David believed his past sin completely cut him off from God's favor, he would have groundlessly claimed these promises. He would have stayed silent. But he is fully persuaded he is not cut off.
Right, he speaks up.
So he compares God to a shield, meaning he's defended by God's might. He concludes God is his glory, because God will be the maintainer and defender of his royal dignity, even when his earthly dignity has been stripped away.
And because of that, he says he will walk with an unabashed brow. He that exalteth my head. Which brings us to verse 4. I have cried to the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay, what do you see?
I want to look closely at the phrasing. David specifically says, with my voice. He does not say, I thought about God, or I felt sad in my spirit. He uses his physical voice.
He distinctly mentions his voice to express that, however much the ungodly might rage against him, he was by no means struck dumb. He pronounced in a loud and distinct voice the name of his God.
Out loud?
Yes, out loud. Doing this was a highly difficult matter under such a grievous and severe temptation. When everyone is telling you God has abandoned you, the hardest thing to do is to speak out loud to him.
There's a great analogy used in historical commentary here. It says, nothing is more unbecoming than sullenly to gnaw the bit with which we are bridled, withholding our groaning from God.
Oh, like that.
I think about a stubborn horse. If you put a metal bit in a horse's mouth and it doesn't want to go where you were directing it, it will just silently, angrily chew on that metal. It resists, it stews in its own frustration, but it doesn't communicate. It just gnaws the bit.
It just sits there and stews.
David does not do that. He does not give way to passionate confusion, and he doesn't just sit in the cave stewing in internal anxiety.
He opposes the voice of prayer to the tumultuous outcries of his enemies. Consider the contrast. Those who curse their luck or blame fortune or sit in sullen silence are just pouring out immoderate sorrow. They're trapped in their own heads.
Yeah, spiraling.
But David lifts up his voice to God. The very God the ungodly imagined had become his enemy.
He actively speaks out loud to break the loop of anxiety. We actually know from modern psychology that vocalizing a thought engages a different part of the brain than just thinking it.
That makes total sense.
When you are spiraling in anxiety, speaking truth out loud physically disrupts the panic. David is doing this. It is a deliberate act of resistance. And he adds that he cried not in vain to encourage all the godly to similar constancy. He wants us to know that vocal, deliberate prayer works.
And we must look at where God hears him from. Verse 4 says, he heard me out of his holy hill.
Now, geographically, this is rich with irony. We need to look at a map. David is hiding in the wilderness. He has crossed the Kidron Valley. He has gone over the Mount of Olives, and he is out in the desolate areas.
Miles away.
He is miles and miles away from Mount Zion, from the physical center of worship. He is far from the tabernacle.
Some interpreters improperly explain the hill of his holiness as referring to heaven. While heaven is often called God's holy palace, here David doubtless has a reference to the Ark of the Covenant, which at that time stood on Mount Zion.
Right.
And he expressly affirms that he was heard from thence, even though he had been compelled to flee into the wilderness.
We have to bring in a brilliant historical cross-reference here from 2 Samuel chapter 15 because it explains perfectly why he mentions the holy hill. When David was fleeing Jerusalem, the priests, including Abiathar, commanded the Levites to carry the Ark of the Covenant with the fleeing king.
He brought it right to him.
They brought the ultimate sacred object, the literal symbol of God's presence, out of the city to go with him into exile. It makes sense, right? If you're going to war, you want the ultimate advantage. And David refused. He sent it back.
He sent it back to Jerusalem. The wonderful faith of the holy man appears conspicuous here. He knew the Lord had chosen Zion to be the dwelling place of the ark. He was willing to be torn from that sacred symbol of the divine presence, which the historical account tells us was as painful to him as if his own bowels had been torn from him, rather than make any innovation not sanctioned by the will of heaven.
Wow.
He refused to manipulate God's prescribed worship for his own comfort.
He chose obedience over the comfort of a physical relic. He could have treated the ark like a lucky rabbit's foot. He could have thought, as long as I have the gold box, I win. But he keeps a due medium, a middle path. He avoided two massive extremes that religious people often fall into.
On one hand, he did not despise the visible sign which the Lord had appointed on account of the rudeness of the times. He didn't say the ark was worthless. On the other hand, he did not attach a superstitious value to a particular physical place, nor did he entertain carnal, fleshly conceptions of the glory of God. He didn't believe God was trapped in the box.
That concept of the due medium is so helpful. He respects the physical symbol, but his faith is in the God behind the symbol. The contrast with how unbelievers pray is striking. Unbelievers often scatter words into the air, vanishing into nothing because they are in doubt to what place they ought to direct their speech.
They don't know who they are talking to.
Exactly. They just send good vibes out into the universe, hoping some undefined energy hears them. But David turned himself directly toward the tabernacle. Why? Because of the promise attached to it. He knew God was near him despite the physical distance.
He directed his faith toward the tabernacle, whence God had promised to be merciful to his servants. God said, I will meet with you above the mercy seat. So David directs his faith there. Hence the confidence with which he prayed.
And we can connect this seamlessly to the modern Christian experience, can't we?
We certainly can. In our day, since there is fulfilled in Christ what was formerly shadowed forth by the figures of the law, a much easier way of approach to God is opened up for us, provided we do not knowingly and willingly wander from the way. Christ is the reality that the physical ark only pointed toward. Christ is the meeting place between God and man.
Which means we have even less excuse to scatter our words into the empty air. We don't have to face Mount Zion when we pray. We have a direct, mediated line of communication through Christ. We can speak directly to the throne room.
That's right.
And the result of that communication for David is perhaps the most shocking part of this entire text. We move to verses 5 and 6. David says, I laid me down and slept. I awaked, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about.
There's a brief linguistic note here that we should clarify. According to Hebrew usage, past tense verbs like I laid me down and slept sometimes be taken for the future. I will lie down and sleep.
Okay, so there's a debate on the timing.
Yes. Some think there is a change of tenses because a future verb follows it in the next verse. But it is much better to retain the past tense, expressing a continuous act and an already experienced reality.
He has already experienced this rest. I laid me down and slept. Think about the context we established at the beginning. Tens of thousands of armed troops are hunting him. His own son wants him dead. He is sleeping on the ground in the wilderness. The adrenaline alone should keep him awake for days, and yet he sleeps.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of human physiology and psychology, it is an absolute miracle. David expresses a wonderful and almost incredible steadfastness of mind in that he slept so soundly in the midst of many deaths, as if he had been entirely beyond the reach of all danger.
It's hard to even fathom.
He'd been tossed amidst merciless waves of anxiety, the grief of a father, the terror of a king, but their violence was allayed by means of faith.
We have to make a careful distinction, though, because people might misunderstand this. This is not the sleep of stupidity.
Right. It is not apathy. It is not someone who just doesn't understand the gravity of the situation, and it is not the fast-asleep intoxication of the wicked, who falsely dream they have made a covenant with death. Even the wicked can sleep soundly if their minds are clouded by arrogance, alcohol, or total delusion.
But David's rest was the peaceful, undisturbed state of a well-regulated mind. He found rest on no other ground but because he was upheld by the strength of God and defended by his help. I marvel at this. I really do. I think about modern insomnia.
Oh, it's an epidemic.
People today lose sleep over a stressful email from their boss. We stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m. because of a looming meeting or a minor financial worry or an awkward social interaction. Our minds race through every worst-case scenario.
We do that all the time.
Our heart rates spike while we are perfectly safe in our comfortable beds. Yet here is a man with an entire nation mobilized to execute him, and he manages to sleep soundly. He says, "I did the ordinary actions of life without being disturbed by fear."
It proves that the godly never fail in proving victorious over all their fears when they actually cast those fears on the Lord, whereas the ungodly, who do not rely upon God, are overwhelmed with despair even when they meet with the smallest perils.
That's such a good point.
A wealthy man without faith will lie awake terrified of losing a small percentage of his portfolio. A man with faith can sleep on the dirt while an army hunts him. David enlarges upon the incalculable efficacy of this confidence. All the godly have some understanding of this from their experience of divine protection. Because God's might is infinite, they conclude it shall be invincible against all the assaults, outrages, preparations, and forces of the whole world.
I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. That is the conclusion. Human courage will always fail unless we stop measuring divine assistance by human metrics. We try to calculate the odds. We look at 10,000 swords and one shield, and we say the odds are 10,000 to 1.
Which is terrible math in this context.
Exactly. We must learn, when in dangers, not to measure the assistance of God after the manner of man, but to despise whatever terrors may stand in our way.
All the attempts which men may make against God are of little or no account. The infinite easily overrides the finite numbers of the enemy. 10,000 is a finite number. God's power, God's strength is infinite. Therefore, the math actually heavily favors David.
Which transitions us into the final deliverance detailed in verses 7 and 8. "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly."
Notice how he goes right back to petitioning God. Even after declaring his quiet state, even after having a great night's sleep, he wakes up and asks to be preserved.
He doesn't assume that one good night means the war is over.
No, he desires the Lord to preserve him in safety during the whole of his life. He's essentially saying, "Lord, since thou hast overthrown my enemies in the past, grant that this thy goodness may follow me today."
It is not uncommon for David to mingle various affections in his prayers. After making mention of his confidence, he returns to the same prayers as at the beginning because he was still in imminent peril. The threat was still physically present. Then we get to the imagery of the smitten cheekbone and the broken teeth.
It is violent, vivid imagery. Striking a jaw, shattering teeth. It paints a picture of a predator being completely neutralized.
Like a lion that can't bite anymore.
Precisely. There are two main ways to explain this. First, it could be that in praying, he calls to his remembrance his former victories to fuel his present faith. He is thinking about the lion and the bear he killed as a boy, or the Philistines he defeated as a young man.
Okay, that makes sense.
Second, having experienced the assistance of God and obtained the answer to his prayers regarding Absalom, perhaps writing this portion after the rebellion was crushed, he now follows it up by thanksgiving.
And the most consistent interpretation sides with the latter, right?
Yes. He declares that he fled to God for help in dangers, humbly prayed for deliverance, and after salvation had been granted, he gives thanks, testifying that he acknowledged God to be the sole author of the deliverance he had obtained. He doesn't credit his generals, Joab or Abishai. He credits God.
Which perfectly sets up the theological climax of the entire psalm in verse 8. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, or as some translate it, salvation is of the Lord.
By these words, David not only claims the office and praise of saving for God alone, but he tacitly opposes God's strength to all human succor. He completely strips away human assistance as the decisive factor.
Even if 1,000 deaths hang over the people, that cannot render God unable to save them. It cannot prevent him from speedily sending forth without any effort the deliverance he is always able to impart. Salvation is not a collaborative effort between human ingenuity and divine backing.
No, it's not a 50-50 split.
It belongs entirely to the Lord.
And notice how the scope broadens at the very end of the text. The psalm shifts from David's individual preservation to a corporate reality. Thy blessing is upon thy people. The end of the psalm affirms that this deliverance was granted not so much to him as an individual, as to the whole people.
The universal church.
You are entirely correct. The preservation of the universal church at that time depended entirely on the safety and prosperity of David's throne. God's covenant was tied to the Davidic line. The promise of the coming Messiah was tied to David's survival.
So the dispersion of this wicked conspiracy, the defeat of Absalom, was not just about saving one man's life or salvaging a political career.
Not at all. It was about the care God had for the safety of his church across all of history.
The final takeaway is incredibly encouraging. We learn that the church shall always be delivered from the calamities which befall her, because God, who is able to save her, will never withdraw his grace and blessing from her. The gates of hell will not prevail.
It connects the historical, literal deliverance of a king in the wilderness to the perpetual, guaranteed deliverance of the people of God throughout history. The affliction was real, the chastisement was severe, the mockery was piercing, but the conclusion was absolute divine victory.
So what does this all mean for us today? We have covered a massive amount of theological and psychological ground. We have watched a man deal with personal failure that resulted in rigorous, devastating chastisement from heaven.
Yeah, a really tough situation.
We saw him absorb intense, targeted mockery that pierced his very soul, taunting him that his math was bad and his God had abandoned him.
We saw him respond not with sullen silence, not with gnawing the bit, but with an active, defiant voice, opposing the outcries of the ungodly with deliberate, out-loud prayer. We examined his careful approach to proper worship, refusing to turn a sacred symbol into a superstition, yet praying confidently toward the promises it represented.
And we witnessed the literal physical rest he achieved, laying down and sleeping while surrounded by an army, sustained entirely by an invisible defense. It is a masterclass in relying on divine promises when every earthly metric predicts your ruin. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We all face situations where the familiar routines and support structures of our lives are stripped away.
We all go through it.
We find ourselves in our own versions of the hiding places of the wilderness. When that happens, when the odds are stacked against you, and especially when the consequences of your own actions are staring you in the face, how do you respond? Do you find yourself anxiously calculating the statistical odds of your survival? Do you let the voices of the critics pierce your soul and convince you that you are beyond help? Or are you able to vocalize your trust, lay down, and sleep, trusting entirely in an invisible, infinite defense? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We appreciate your time, and we hope you continue to pursue this kind of analytical curiosity. Until next time.